All right, so now we're ready, and I'm sure you'll remember from last week that we started a new lecture series, and the topic of the lecture series, Justice, Care, Ethics, and the Lifespan Revolution, is focused on the basic fact that human beings are now living, and I think I may have understated things a little bit last week, maybe four times as long as we've lived on average for most of human history, and twice as long as we were living in relatively recent history, and 30 years longer than we were living just a couple generations ago, and that children born today will likely live to 100, at least they're more likely to than not to. And so we have a longer lifespan in the 21st century than we've ever had before. And from a first person point of view, that means we have more years to work with. And it turns out that many of those years are actually healthy, happy, potentially productive years. And so one of the questions here is, what do we do with those additional years? And I'm calling that an ethical question. How do we have meaning, ambition, purpose, love, connection, inclusion across all phases of life, including this relatively new third long phase that, following Louise Aronson, I'm going to refer to as elderhood. But it's also the case that this raises some cultural and social issues, and in ways that we talked a little bit about last week and that I'll continue to work through this week. I think ageism may be our least self-conscious form of discrimination, prejudice, maybe even caste in contemporary society, and that our society remains built in ways that don't take into account the lifespan revolution, whether we're talking about our architecture or our provision of social goods, the way we approach careers, that we just are still, in a sense, living in a society where the assumption is that the main phases of life all occur in the period from birth to the 1960s, right? I'm sorry, to the 60s. And so this is a different life that we now live. It has an additional 25, 30 productive years. How do we structure society to include, to accommodate, to care for uh, uh, people living longer lives? And how do we make sure that the inclusion as well as the provision of services and care is just? And that's the big theme. We're beginning to get some traction on it, though. I want to continue really with some of the more basic ideas, and so today I'm going to look at this from a medical and a neuroscientific perspective, drawing on a couple different authors who work in those fields. And that is in order to set up some of those additional perspectives that are more to do with ethics, society, and justice. We need to understand the nature of the final third of human life as well as understanding some of the forces giving rise to ageism or to our failure as a society and a culture to adequately reckon with the lifespan revolution. And I think, I always welcome your comments, your questions, your disagreements as well. And in particular on this topic, I feel a little awkward talking to an audience about their period in life. So by all means, engage me, correct me if necessary. So I'm going to jump in, but I can't see you when I'm in this screen share mode. Just unmute yourself, put something in the chat whenever you want to say something. All right. So here's the basic thing we're talking about, right? And this is where I say I've underestimated things, right? For the vast majority of human history, the human lifespan was probably something like 20 years. Now it's approaching and soon to be over 80 years, right? And even in the middle ages and early modern Europe, we increased the lifespan by 50%. And that might seem quite substantial. And I would just point out that as far as I know, we are the only species of biological life on the planet Earth that has increased its lifespan, right? And not just by a little bit. So even increasing it by 50%, that's quite phenomenal. That's what we had done through early modern times. And then if we begin to look at the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden we've doubled the lifespans, and then get into the 20th century. And again, it's not just that the lifespan is increasing, the pace at which it's increasing is so accelerated at this point, right? It takes us hundreds of thousands of years to increase it by 50%. And then over the course of a century, we nearly double it again, right? And so it is in a sense understandable that the social and cultural and ethical learning necessary to accommodate this revolution is lagging behind this revolution. But having said that, I think we are all the worse off for not having adjusted our ideas about human life, its purpose, its meaning, how it can be distributed over the different stages of life, and also our understanding of society and justice to take into account this really important demographic change. None of us is well served. And so it's worthwhile. It's about time to be thinking about it more systematically. Another way of looking at this would be to look at what the lifespan revolution does to the distribution of population across demographic and in particular age categories, right? And I pointed out to you that at the beginning of the 20th century, the Census Bureau didn't bother to keep track of people 85 or older because it's such a negligible portion of the population, it wasn't worth gathering those statistics. And that at the beginning of the 20th century, right, the age group that was 65 or older was a tiny sliver of the population. It is now the case that, right, we have about 4 or 5% of our population 85 or older. That's going to keep increasing over the next decades. And the portion of our population that is 65 and older is approaching 20% and going to be as high as 25% by the middle of the 21st century. So, right, 1 in 4 people in our society will fall into this category, elderhood. We really have to figure out what to expect, how to handle, and in what ways to include productively and with meaningful forms of connection and outlet a full quarter of the population. To fail to do that is, it seems to me, to commit a systematic injustice to a large portion of the population, and also simply to fail in an essential human task. And so the more I read about this, the more I think that my hunch in putting this class together is right, that this is one of the essential issues that the United States and other countries need to be figuring out how to handle in the middle of the 21st century. Another way, just to continue thinking about, and I know this is review, and so I'm just making sure we've got our legs under us as we start thinking about these problems. Another way to think about the demographics here is to think about the typical distribution of people across ages in a society. And typically it is a pyramidal, right? And what that means is that the largest group is the youngest. Um, that has stopped being the case because on the one hand, people are having fewer children, and on the other hand, childhood mortality is much less than it used to be. And so, right, the numbers go stably up. And then because we are living longer, right, you get up to the 90s and hundreds, and yes, there's a little uh, top to the cupola, but basically it's a rectangle. And so that's a very different kind of society. It challenges our anthropological assumptions. It creates institutional and ethical difficulties. We need to start thinking this through. Um, Last basic metric in thinking about this, and there's something that I showed last week, and then something new here. This is from Daniel Levitin's work, Successful Aging. It's not a wonderful diagram, but it conveys an idea effectively. It's not just that we're living longer, it's that we are healthier later in life. And I spoke with you a little bit last week about the fact that some of this is medical breakthroughs, but the medical breakthroughs that are most important, it turns out, are really in the development of antibiotics, penicillin, et cetera, and vaccinations, right? And then developments in nutrition, sanitation, food storage and handling. These are the things that really have resulted in a situation where not only are we living longer, but we're healthier for many more years. And as you can see, 80 to 90% of Americans are now making it into their late 70s and still basically facing no health-based limitations. It's not until you get into your 80s and older that you move into the territory where it's 25% of people who have health-based limitations, but that still means it's nearly 3/4 who don't have those limitations. And so Levitin just visualizes something we were talking about last week, I think nicely in this diagram, which is the difference between your lifespan and your health span. And he compares two people, Grace and Eloise, made up characters just to get us at the idea that although they each lived to be 100 years old, we would clearly prefer Eloise's life to Grace's life. And so Grace begins to suffer disease at around age 50. And in the way that Levitin presents it, by the time she gets to be 65, she is facing serious limitations on what she can do. And so although, sorry, she lives to be 100, she is very limited in the last third of her life. On the other hand, Eloise, right, stays perfectly healthy until she's 70 and then gets another 25 years on this telling of remaining functional before then having debilitating disease. And Levitin's point is that obviously we would prefer Eloise to Grace, not because of their lifespans, which are identical, but because of their health spans. Now, I want to come out of the slides here for a second to ask you a question. And here's, this is based on surveys conducted throughout the world. And there are multiple surveys that have been aggregated. What decade of life do you think most people in the world who live to be in their 90s list as the happiest decade of their life? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Okay, I'll supply the answer. I know it's a little awkward sometimes to unmute yourself. I think you're going to be surprised. It's the 80s, right? And what the data shows is that the distribution of happiness across life is actually what they call a U curve. It starts out high, it goes down in middle age, and goes back up at the end of life, right? The age that these people who live into their 90s, nonagerians, I believe they're called, list as being the happiest year of their life is 82. Anybody out there 82 right now? And so what they find when they interview these people is they say, look, the middle ages, although I'm healthiest, although I have the highest productivity and functionality, is also the years in which I have the highest level of stress. It's the years in which I have to make the most money and have the most responsibilities. And then you add to that when you're in that period, you're most concerned with what other people think about you. And that turns out to be a huge source of stress. And that by the time you get into your 80s, you kind of are over caring about what other people think about you. And you no longer, having successfully navigated that period, have all those sources of stress. So it's interesting, right? So Bob is asking, is this based on data in the US? No, actually, Bob, it's based on worldwide surveys. And if you want, not right now, but I could give you via email the citations. But no, it's an aggregation of surveys throughout the world. This is true in Africa. This is true in Asia. This is true in Europe. This is true in Latin America, in addition to being true in the US. Marion, go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Yeah. Okay. What I want to say is right here, right now, we're aware that the elder population really falls into two categories. There's the very happy early 80s who come in full of active ideas of ways to change the world, and one committee after another benefits from their services. And then as they glide into the 90s, you go back to being considerably less healthy and less happy. The elder the elder population is certainly divided and going the opposite direction than the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And so Louise Aronson calls this stage 3 versus stage 4. And so there are different ways to express this. I'll get into her diagram in a moment. But yes, and I think that chart from Daniel Levitin's book, right? Those two people live to be the same age, but one of them has her health and her ability to be in control of her life present for the vast majority of her life, and one of them doesn't. Obviously, you prefer to be the second person. And we're going to get into this, but from a point of view of medical reform, Aronson agrees with Levitin that what we need to be concerned with is maximizing the health span, not the lifespan. And to the extent that medicine assumes a perspective of a middle-aged person and the normality of the health situation of the middle-aged person, they tend to intervene, to do everything possible to cure a disease or heal an injury. And we'll talk more about that. That may make sense if you're 30, 40, 50 years old. Does that still make sense if you're in your 80s or your 90s? And Aronson is suggesting that we need a more holistic approach to medical interventions. There are, and we have to be honest and direct about this, which is to say that nobody lives forever, right? The maximum human lifespan really at this point, and for most of human history, appears to be around 120 years, right? And very few of us get that far. But eventually, the language on this is funny, maybe not funny, but either disease gets us or things just fall apart, right? The organs of the body senescence, it's sometimes referred to, are not going to function forever, right? And so yes, how do we conceive of maintaining our health in order to maintain our well-being as long as possible, recognizing that it's inevitable that eventually we're going to fail? And then the second question is, how do we handle that period in which we fail, right? And those are separate questions, and I do think there's a lot of dread associated with failing health, with really being debilitated or incapacitated. And so one of the things Aronson and others try to argue is we have to be careful not to have irrational fear of that period of life. But then the other thing we have to do is to figure out how to handle that period of life with maximum humanity, right? And she points out that, and I suspect this is less true at Piedmont Gardens than it is in many other places in this country and the world, that the facilities that handle those who are in that fourth stage are often just warehouses and rather inhumane, and that's an awful thing to do to people, and that we would dread it less if we had a more honest and open conception of what it's like to be in that phase of life, but that we would also dread it less if we were better at creating humane institutions for that final phase of life. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Marion. Good comment, and thank you, Bob, also. And please keep them coming. I know this is stuff that has very direct relevance to your life situations. All right. So that was the review of the factual background. This is the review of the big questions I think that factual background raises. And so if life is, and I'll just throw a figure out there, 30 years longer on average than it was 100 years ago, and if maybe 25 of those years are good, healthy, potentially meaningful and productive years, then how do we conceive of a complete life with dignity and meaning across all its phases? Daniel Levitin, who's the neuroscientist whose work I'm looking at right now, tells a number of personal stories, some about his grandfather and father, both of whom were forced out of their primary professions in their early 60s. And he points out that with his grandfather, that meant his life was basically over and he didn't live much longer than that. With his father actually found a second career. And then Levitin points out that he's a neuroscientist. He did his PhD at McGill University, which has one of the leading programs in that field, and that his mentors in that program when he was a young man are all in their 80s or 90s right now, and there's 6 or 7 of them, and they're all professionally active, still doing research, still doing teaching, still engaged in inventing new paradigms, and that this is then maybe the ideal of a complete long life that continues to have meaning, productivity, activity, inclusion, engagement into the later years, but that it's going to take rethinking how we structure careers, how we structure society, how we think about age to be able to do this. So ageism, and I'm going to get into this more deeply, but as I said at the outset, I think this is the one basically remaining. Maybe there are others. Maybe body type discrimination would be another, but there are fewer basically openly tolerated and permissible forms of prejudice in our society. And this is a particularly odd one because it's prejudice against your future self, right? But that we need to work on our culture in the same way that the civil rights movement and the LGBTQ movement and the feminist movement work to take previously maligned identity categories and to revalue them, to remove the stigma, and thereby to increase equality for those who had been hitherto stigmatized. We need a similar campaign to exercise ageism from our culture. And then how is it that we once allow people who are older to be more productive, more included, more loving, more networked throughout their lives, and also provide care for them? And I think this is essential to acknowledge that we require often greater care when we are later in life. We are less strong, we are less energetic. Things about our eyes or our ears or our knees don't work as well as they used to work. And that shouldn't be an excuse for marginalizing, neglecting, stigmatizing this portion of the population, but it does have to be reckoned with, right? And this then means that we have to think not only about the portion of the population that is now elderly, but also the portion of the population that provides that care, and how we can do that with dignity for the care providers as well. And here then I think one of the things that I find fascinating about this issue is it really gets us into other issues, right? Where we recognize that the majority of care providers in our society are women, that the majority of the women providing care are women of color, that many of them are immigrants. And so several of the axes of injustice at work in our society intersect in this issue. And so we have to figure out how to not make the provision of care unjust or unjustly distributed and compensated. Um, by the way, I do think that this potentially gives us an opportunity to think through the nature of prejudice as such. One of the authors I'm reading says, look, this is probably the first time in their lives that straight, white, middle class men who are white experience some kind of discrimination or stigma. And it happens so late in their lives, it's maybe too late for them to learn the full lessons of this. But I don't think that that last bit is necessarily right, that as a culture, the fact that we're going to suffer from this discrimination eventually might help us to more empathetically identify with the victims of discrimination, and therefore to make it more likely that we can continue the progress we've made in dismantling our forms of caste and discrimination. Revising scripts for the elder and the recognition afforded to them, and here I'm drawing on the literature on ascriptive identity, on those big identity categories where you just look at someone and say, I know what group you belong to, and I know what people like you are supposed to be like. And the fact that many of us internalize those scripts, right? Treat them not just as something imposed on us, but something that we in fact are either required or maybe even happy to inhabit. And so we're going to have to change the script of later life in order to change the range of options available to people later in life. And so this is going to require structural change for our society as a whole, whether in terms of careers or in terms of the way in which we structure work or care or family. Uh, it has wide ranging implications. I'll just review very briefly. I don't want to get too bogged down in this. The quote from Laura Carstensen, the head of the um, longevity initiative at Stanford University, and I think she just puts it so clearly. We must recognize that we're living in a world that was quite literally designed for young people. Only 4% of the population was over 65 in 1900. In a very broad sense, we need to very quickly build a culture, build up that knowledge base, recast the physical environment, and deeply rethink social norms so that the culture that supports us allows people to feel a sense of belonging and purpose and worth for 100 years. And so that's the jumping off place. And I showed you the way in which she visualizes this, I think. And I'm not going to try to unpack all the cartoons, but having said that, on the one hand, we have age, right, from 0 to 100. And on the other hand, we have percentage, and that's a rough rubric for how secure, how included, how much meaning, how many resources we have access to. And I don't know if it shows up fully, but there's basically, right, a declining line here where, right, you know, from 0 to 50, at least potentially many people have 100% health, educational resources, social connectiveness, environment, work, and financial security. But then the closer we get, 60, 70, 80, 90, it declines, right? And so getting us to a point where we can get into our 80s and 90s and still be close to 100% of the capability that our society associates with full agency. That's another way, I think, of thinking the goal of justly managing the lifespan revolution. So I started introducing you last week to Louise Aronson, and I learned that she'd actually come to speak with you guys, and she's, as you then know, a pioneer in the field of geriatric medicine, a dissident within American medicine as a whole, someone who heads, among other things, an institute on the humanities in medicine. That's her professorship at UCSF, and that pioneered, among other things, a home visit based geriatric medical practice in San Francisco. And so one of the things that makes Aronson a dissident in medicine is that she believes that medicine not only replicates society's ageism, but actually substantially contributes to it, or maybe even has primary responsibility for it. And I want to get into that in just a moment. Before I do that, I just want to note the way in which she conceptualizes her overarching idea, which is that we have, up until quite recently, lived in societies and cultures that essentially have only two phases in life as their primary understanding of what is involved in life: childhood and adulthood. And so, right, the way Carstensen put it, right, we cut off around 65, and what that means is we miss out on elderhood altogether. And what Aronson is suggesting is that we need to add this third category, and that in a sense we need to model it on childhood. And so geriatrics is modeled on pediatrics, right? And the idea of childhood, we'll get into this in a moment, relatively recent construct, is that children should not be viewed as pathologically deviant from adulthood in the way that in many respects maybe childhood was viewed in earlier phases of at least European history, but instead as having its own developmental landmarks and goals and distinct criteria for judging success. And so uh, right, we've got infant, toddler, child, tween, teen, and young adult concentrated in childhood. Similarly, she suggests we should have senior, old, elderly, aged, concentrated in elderhood, and judge each of those phases not by the standards of adulthood, but by what is typical in terms of health for that phase. And then the other thing this diagram suggests is that there is a trajectory here, an arc, as you can see, of moving from fairly complete dependence for care on others to much greater independence. I think it would be a mistake to read this as in some way we're perfectly independent. The feminist ethics of care literature suggests we all remain dependent on care at every phase of our life, but there are differences in degree, and obviously infants who cannot feed, etc., for themselves, right? Who need uh, adults to provide for them are much more dependent than fully mature adults. And similarly, as we enter the last phases of elderhood, we become highly dependent again. So, with all of that in mind, now let me move on to Aronson's ideas about medicine. And I think the way I want to do this is I want to start with a quotation. And so it's Aronson quoting one of the early 20th century founders of the field of geriatric medicine. This man's name is Ignaz Nasher. And you will have to forgive me for reading out to you his rather condescending and disdainful views, but it gets to a point, which is and the point here is that Aronson suggests that we live in a culture that has fundamentally changed the value associated with aging. And in earlier European culture, in Asian culture, in African culture, she cites many examples, the elderly were esteemed. It was a particular position of social prestige within early European Christendom. You were thought to be closer to God when you were older because you were closer to death and closer to moving on to the kingdom of God. You were thought to be wiser, more accomplished, more empathetic, more tolerant, quicker to good judgment when you were older. And that over the last 150 years, we have replaced the religious, cultural worldview and the esteem that it attaches to the elderly with a more scientific and specifically medical conception of elderhood, which views aging primarily through the lens of bodily disease, right? And this then, she suggests, is a way in which medicine doesn't just reflect, but in fact actively contributes to the ageism of our society. And so it's in this context that she quotes from one of the founders of geriatrics. Here's Nasher's quote. Forgive me in advance. We realize that for all practical purposes, the lives of the aged are useless, that they are often a burden to themselves, their families, and to the community at large. Their appearance is generally unesthetic, their actions objectionable, their very existence often an incubus to those who, in the spirit of humanity or duty, take upon themselves the care of the aged. There is a natural reluctance to exert oneself for those who are economically worthless and must remain so, or to strive against the inevitable, though there be the possibility of momentary success, or to devote time and effort in so unfruitful a field, when both can be used to greater material advantage in other fields of medicine. Now, remember, that's one of the primary founders of geriatric medicine, being incredibly condescending and disdainful about the population he is proposing that doctors dedicate themselves to treating, right? It's almost apologizing in advance. And I kind of want to apologize as well for even reading that out, but it helps to get at one of the points that Aronson is trying to make, which is that medicine has contributed to dehumanizing older patients, and to the extent that medicine has become authoritative or normative for our culture, that we attach now a special prestige to the medical profession as the people best equipped to maintain and preserve our health. As a culture, we may very well have internalized a fair bit of medicine's prejudice against the elderly. And I want to develop this idea. And now I'm going to be quite uh, brief but wide ranging. In some of the literature that I think is relevant to understanding this, a fair bit of this is brought in by Aronson herself, and I think I've recommended the book to you already. She is very wide ranging in the literature she draws on. Some of this is the further research I'm doing as well. So what is the relevant conceptual background for understanding how and why it is that medicine has contributed to the dehumanization of elderhood? And here I want to start with one of the pioneers of medical anthropology, Arthur Kleinman. And in his seminal work, The Illness Narratives, he distinguishes between disease and illness. And the basic idea here is that disease is biological, right? And so if you have a kidney disease, you go and see a doctor who specializes in kidney disease, and he's all about the organ, right? You know, he wants to do a biopsy or some kind of scan, figure out what's going on in your kidneys. Illness is about the experience of the individual suffering the disease, right? And so we don't just have organs that suffer health crises. We have narratives we tell about ourselves, and when we narrate ourselves, we indicate what is significant and important to us, and in what ways, for instance, kidney failure might be relevant to, but not necessarily the be all and end all of our lives, right? So if you focus on the person and not the organ, you're focusing on the illness and not exclusively on the disease. And part of what Kleinman and Aronson and others point out is that American medicine, in its effort to secure its scientific standing and prestige, has tended to focus on disease and not on illness. Susan Sontag, who I know many of you are familiar with already, a major 20th century philosopher, literary critic, cultural theorist, feminist, in her wonderful book from the, I think, mid 1970s, Illness as Narrative, points out that in addition to making this important distinction between disease and illness, if we're going to be honest about where those resources that we use to narrate our stage of life, our health, our well-being come from, that they're not just individuals reflecting upon themselves, they're narrative structures that our culture gives us, and that our culture can vary, that often, and this is part of Sontag's work, we use illness as a metaphor, and then the metaphorical dimension of the illness comes back to influence the way in which we actually interpret the implications for our lives of health difficulties. And so all of this gets at then the third idea here, the social construction of life stages. And there's a French, I think we might now call him a historicist or postmodernist theorist, anthropologist also, Philippe Ariz. And he, in a book that was translated in the early 1960s as Centuries of Childhood, made this very controversial claim of the kind that the French often like to make, that until early modern Europe, there were no children. Right. And what he meant was not that there were no human beings who were from 0 to 18 years old, but that European culture did not consider that phase of life a distinct phase of life, so that the concept of childhood as different from adulthood was lacking. And that this reflected the fact that we, from a very young age, were engaged in the same kind of productive labor that would be characteristic of adult life, that by the time we were 6 or 7, we were working in the fields in a peasant agrarian subsistence economy, that very often humans did not survive their childhood, and therefore parents and cultures and societies did not invest a lot emotionally into children, because to do so was to open yourself to hurt. And then finally, that, and another kind of hallmark of adulthood, very often people married at 12, 13, 14 years old, right? And so really it's only with industrialization that we begin thinking about this phase of life as a distinct phase of life. And the point, I think, in the context of our discussion is to point out that therefore we need to take the stages of life, the associations with each of those stages, the way in which we interpret their characteristic potentials and liabilities, as not given, but open to renegotiation, refiguring, as we get new information, new ideas, new experiences. And just as we invented childhood as at a certain period in European history, we can invent elderhood at the current moment. But that will involve, among other things, changing the way we think about the relationship between disease and illness and the kind of metaphors we tell about illness. If, as is Aronson's suggestion, we primarily think about being an elder in terms that are bodily, right? In terms that emphasize being no longer fully functional, then we're treating aging from a medical perspective. And that one of the things that Aronson is suggesting is that we need to treat it as a distinct life stage, one not identified with its infirmities. Those are real, but that's by no means the totality of this phase of life. I hardly need to say this to you, but as a culture, we still need to digest this. Next, I'm going to draw on Simone de Beauvoir. And some of you may be aware that in addition to The Other Sex, and about 20 years after the publication of The Other Sex, when she was older, she wrote this book, The Coming of Age. At least that's the way it's typically translated, sometimes translated of old age, but the better title, the better translation is The Coming of Age. And de Beauvoir, of course, is French, and she's living in the French society of the 50s and 60s, which is a society that particularly sexualizes young women, right? And then she comes into her 60s and 70s and has this experience, as she puts it, of becoming essentially invisible to the male gaze, and more generally speaking, to the social gaze as a whole. And so I think, right, that that's the social or cultural context in which she then revises some of the feminist ideas she has to take into account ageism as well. And those ideas have to do with the way in which we construct our social identities, what's sometimes called the logic of identity construction, and that it's really impossible to identify who you are without differentiating who you are not, right? And that is, it seems to me, essential to the logic of identity. But what is not essential, but nevertheless typical and perhaps all but psychologically irresistible, at least at first, is to not just say, I am this and not that, right? I am female and not male, or male and not female, but to then also place the two identities in a hierarchy of value in which what one identifies oneself with is different from what one isn't. And so the very title of The Second Sex, right, refers to the fact that men who have been both socially and culturally dominant don't just differentiate themselves from women, but attach greater value to masculine identity and masculine characteristics. And in The Coming of Age, de Beauvoir points out that the young and capable middle-aged people who want to think of themselves as vigorous and productive, as having agency and strong relationships, do this in part by differentiating themselves from those who are older and then denying all of those capabilities to those who are older than them. And in the same way that de Beauvoir tried to deconstruct the gender hierarchy and the way in which, right, the civil rights movement tried to remove the prioritization or status hierarchy from race, de Beauvoir is suggesting we need to do the same thing with age, but that this is very difficult to do. And then part of what Aronson is pointing out is that doctors tend to do this too. They tend to take up a perspective of the adult and to treat the adult body as normal and normative for health, and therefore to view the elder body not as a different phase in the way that pediatrics tends to view the child's body, but as intrinsically a pathological deviation from an adult body, a failing body. And so Aronson thinks this is extremely important to resist. I imagine some of you are familiar with the extremely important work of Paul Farmer in public health, and he's one of the leaders of the movement of trying to bring healthcare to the developing world, but also doing so in ways that did not reflect a colonial perspective, right? And so took seriously the cultural as well as the health needs of developing societies. And he's one of the originators of this, I think, very important literature on the social determinants of health. And I'm going to stick with the core implications of this idea for us in this topic. And one finding, and we've talked a lot about this in the context of inequality, right? That a more unequal society, among other things, tends to be a less healthy society. And part of the reason that it's a less healthy society is that it's a society with higher levels of status anxiety and what's often called social evaluative threat. And that to take it into its simplest terms, a more unequal society, the distance between the rungs of society is greater. That means that as you look up, as you look down, you see people who look less like you, who appear to have different levels of resources, different social attributes, and you get more concerned about how they're viewing you. Are they looking down at you with disdain? Are they looking up at you with envy and resentment? And that triggers a kind of social stress that it turns out is really bad for us. And in the context of this topic, I do think that one of the things we need to think through is what happens to people who are in a different stage of life when the people who look at them as deficient, and do we end up internalizing that social prejudice against us? And if we do, what does it do to our health, to our well-being, to our social stress levels, to be susceptible to that kind of double consciousness in which we don't just see ourselves for what we know we are, but also have to worry that we're being pathologized by society, and the role that the medical profession plays in legitimating and even fostering that pathologizing perspective. Um, Final couple categories here. One of them has to do with the way in which, in the early modern period, we gave great cultural and social power to the medical profession to define what is health and what is normal. And you are probably hearing the echoes of the great Michel Foucault and one of his very first works, The Birth of the Clinic, and thinking through how medical professionals monopolize the authority to talk in a legitimate and scientific way about what health is. And obviously, Aronson, a doctor herself, thinks that this is a problem, that doctors are the only ones who get to control the discourse about health and normal health functioning. Everything I've said so far is kind of cultural, anthropological. I want to point finally to the more structural. And there are two aspects of this. One of them has to do with care. And so one of the things that Aronson is pointing to, and it's not her alone, is that people in their elderhood, particularly in the fourth stage or when disease becomes more of an issue, need not just medical intervention, but broader forms of care, but that the medical profession devalues the provision of care. it's seen as women's work. It's seen as the area of competence of nurses and social workers, not doctors. And even though it is now the case that more than 50% of the new doctors are women, um, the message is clear within the medical profession that if you want the full prestige, if you want the high compensation that this profession delivers, you leave the care labor to others. We manage disease through biological intervention. And then finally, when we get into the deepest structural level here, it's worthwhile pointing out, of course, that the provision of medical care is funded primarily by private insurance and health maintenance organizations in this country, and they determine how doctors can treat patients and what they will be compensated for. And one of the ways that Aronson puts this that I think is wonderful in capturing, almost an aphorism, the perversity of the American medical care system is that good health is bad business. Arthur Applebaum, a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, in his book Ethics for Adversaries, says, look, if doctoring is a medical professional attending to the needs and interests of their patients, we've mainly replaced doctoring with schmoctoring, right? Which he says is what the healthcare industry encourages doctors to do to maximize the profits of that industry and the compensation for the doctors themselves. And this comes down to coding, right? You can only bill the insurance company for what you can code. And as Aronson points out, a large portion of what she thinks doctors should be doing, talking with their patients, determining what their goals in life are and whether or not this or that procedure will contribute to their well-being and agency, figuring out how their lives are structured and whether or not their lives are conducive to their health, their well-being, and their agency. There's no code for any of that. It can't be billed. It's uncompensated work, and you actually get penalized for doing all of this, right? And so this is then the background for the dual claim that Aronson, I think, puts at the center of her work. On the one hand, the medical profession is in many ways responsible for the fact that so many of us dread elderhood or attach negative value to this phase in life. And relatedly, that we need deep-seated reform in medical care in order to make this phase of life more valuable, less discriminated against, and in particular, to be able to assign agency to the elderly over this phase in their lives. I'll stop there. I imagine you guys have thoughts and questions. I hope I haven't hit too many raw nerves in talking this stuff through. There's a little bit more with Aronson, and then I want to get into the neuroscience of this as well, but that'll have to wait for next week. And Flossie, I can see you're eager to go. Have you hit your space bar so you're unmuted?
Yes.
Yay, go ahead.
What you have done, and I thank you for it, is that you have reminded me of my own childhood, where I remember visiting my grandparents, but I also remember how devoted my parents were to their parents. You were obligated, but more than obligated, you loved your parents. My mother wept when her mother died. She wept when her father died. She missed them. And she took care of them as much as she could. This kind of caring I sometimes see at Piedmont Gardens, but it has come actually to pass that we're relieved when our parents go. Have you lost me?
No, we still got you, Bonnie. I think somehow you shared your screen, and it's a nice picture, but it's keeping us from seeing each other. Can you undo that, Bonnie? But let me see. Maybe I can undo that.
I will finish very quickly.
Go ahead.
It brings me back and makes me understand how difficult it is today to have that same kind of actual love and tenderness that has vanished from us, I think, because we're under so many different pressures. And you also remind me that kids went to work when they were 6 and 7. It was true of my father's life, and also true of my older brother's life. He was expected to do a lot of work for my father, even handling the business end of my father's work. It all comes back and makes not only narrative sense, but it breaks my heart too. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think in these terms. One of the things I've been thinking about as I've been reading this is my great grandmother, who lived with my grandparents, who lived in Berkeley, and so I saw her on a regular basis, but she was basically deaf and not very communicative, and then ended up in a nursing home, and I would go visit her in a nursing home, and I can just remember being 10, 11, 12 years old, and being not very sympathetic, not really understanding who this person was, or that she was not just somebody to be pitied, but somebody to be loved and respected. And part of what's brought this into focus for me is I spend a fair bit of time with my uncle, so this was his grandmother, and he tells all these wonderful stories about this woman from his childhood, and how active and energetic and interesting she was, and that I didn't get that window, and that I didn't figure out how to relate to her better. I regret. John, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Actually, I have three things. One is, if you could get out of your full, your screen share, I think that would get rid of this.
I tried, John. I got it down to
get out of screen share,
but I haven't been able to get it. Oh, wait a sec. I think there's a different option. There we go. Yeah, okay.
The second point is, I think it's a little easy to over romanticize how wonderful things were and how well older people were treated in the old days. By and large, in this country and most other places, I think they're probably treated better now than they ever have been before in human history. But the main point I wanted to make is that I don't like your assumption. You start out talking about medical care, and then you go into care, right? As if care is somehow subservient to medical care or has anything to do with it. Actually, in most countries that are successful at doing this sort of a thing, the care business, long-term care as we call it, or including home-based care and so forth, is quite separate consideration from medical care, and doctors don't have anything to do with it, and that works better, I think, usually.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, John, and so France. I don't know. Maybe you're thinking of Japan. I know less about Japan, but yes, the part of the problem that Aronson is identifying with America is that the provision of care is primarily dispensed within the medical establishment and been medicalized. And so she thinks, on the one hand, the doctors need to have greater respect for and attention to care, but on the other hand, that care needs to have its own autonomy and not be medicalized. So I think we're in agreement on that, and that there are societies that do this in the way that they provide state-supported home-based care that are much better than the United States. And although it might be part of their public health system, it is not the province or exclusive authority of doctors to determine how this is done. So yes, thank you. And I'm sorry if I gave the impression otherwise. Did you want to follow up at all, John, on that? Okay, Iris, go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, hi
Good.
there. I wanted to mention something. Until we get into widespread robotics, millions of workers, male and female, are doing heavy lifting that tire their bodies out by the time they're 60. And we cannot use this paradigm of elderhood for the vast majority of people going into their 60s and 70s. Their bodies are worn. So that's one thing. The medicalization is another thing. Doctors have a lot of power and they're holding on as long as they can. And I don't blame them, except that we need to define their arena as disease. That's what they're trained to do. If you want to deal with the social and cultural aspects of aging, you need a different team. Now, they could be part of the medical team, but a lot more authority has to be handed to them. And we have to give honor to those discussions about life care and so forth. I think those of you who belong to Kaiser probably appreciate Kaiser pushed very hard for decisions to be made within families to define your future. So you do have agency. A lot of people are still trapped in the old idea, if I talk about it, it's going to happen. So we have some cultural shifts that need to be made within our society to grapple with elderhood as a defined area that needs a care institution that will not just work with the very disabled, but work on a broader scale to define what does aging mean for you, your family, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. And the information about Kaiser is interesting. I would like to get more information. Maybe I'm going to have to do a little bit more research on that. And obviously, Kaiser, as far as I know, California only. Is that right? And the uncle who I was just mentioning, he gets his healthcare from Kaiser because he was a lifelong school teacher. Anyway, let me come back to your first point, though, first. And Daniel Levitin, whose work I haven't been able to talk about much today, the book, which I will talk with you about next week, Successful Aging. By the way, the cover image I really like, which is that's a brain, right, done as if it were a tree trunk, right? But he points out that a lot of the determinants of how we age are actually early childhood experiences. And then, of course, experiences that we have both bodily, environmental, and cognitive in our adulthood, right? And so I absolutely agree with you. You know, I wonder, and I guess it depends how global our perspective is on this, right? We're increasingly a post-industrial society. That doesn't mean that a lot of us aren't still doing hard physical labor and that we aren't then wearing the scars of that labor for the rest of our lives. But having said that, the data that shows that basically we are healthy increasingly into our mid-70s and later, that at least we have the level of health that allows us to be fully functional in our society. I think that's worth emphasizing. And then if we add to that, look, part of the problem here is how our society is built. I frequently fly back and forth from California to New York and vice versa, and not as frequently as I used to. I used to do it all the time, and I like taking the subway and BART, and for environmental reasons, for economic reasons, that's really what I would prefer to do. But if you're doing it with 2 suitcases and you don't know whether the escalator or the elevator is going to work, it's a real problem, right? And I've frequently been in the situation where I'm trying to carry 2 heavy suitcases up the stairs, and they're long staircases, and that just puts me in the mind of, what about somebody on a walker? What about somebody with a cane? What about somebody with bad knees, or heaven forbid in a wheelchair, right? That it's an impossible situation for them. And so in addition to perhaps structuring our work, you mentioned robotics, et cetera, so that we do less damage to our bodies so that we can maintain our functionality. The other side of this is structuring our society for people who have various disabilities as a result of aging. And by the way, although hard physical labor accelerates the decline of joints and muscles and often results in injuries that plague you later in life, those joints eventually decline, right? It's just the nature of wear and tear on the body. And so building our physical environment so that it's available to everyone, I think is another really important front in this. Let's see, in the chat very quickly, Renee says, I agree that you spend most of your lives worrying about what others are thinking of you, and by 50 or so, you don't care what others are thinking about you. However, by the time you reach 80, you realize that no one was ever thinking about you at all. And maybe that's part of the reason that 80 is that life, that peak of the happiness curve in life. You get over it, right? John adds, a problem with Kaiser is that it has no geriatrics on the staff. When asked about that, somebody explained that their docs did often take a course in med school, and he says that's probably unlikely. And what Aronson points out, she went to Harvard Medical School in the late 1980s and then did her residency at UCSF. And at both institutions, there was no geriatric instruction
There's no money in it.
available at
Yes.
all, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yes, and I suggested, as when I was out there a few weeks ago and I was working with my father, I went to his primary care physician, having read Aronson, I said, is there any possibility he could see a geriatrician just to get that perspective on his current healthcare regime? And the primary care physician said the only way you get to see a geriatrician is if you transfer your primary care to the geriatrician. And by the way, the waiting list is about 2 years.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. So yeah, the access to it is not great. All right, we've gone way over. I enjoyed being with you today. I hope this is a good use of our time together. I'm enjoying this and learning from it. And it's good being in dialogue with you about it. There's a lot more territory to cover, and I want to continue. Give me feedback if this is not productive use of our time, let me know. And I will also, as I said last week, if politics intrudes, if there's stuff in the news that we really need to talk about, we can pivot back and forth. We don't have to do this exclusively. But I do hope this is meaningful for you guys. Thank you. And I'll see you next week. Take care of yourselves. Stay dry. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.